Delroy Lindo stepped out of the filming room in a heavy state that only he truly understood. It was not the fatigue of a normal workday, but the feeling of being torn in two between two lives that he had carried for more than half a century. One life was that of a black man who grew up amid overlapping cultural boundaries, always having to find his own way to define himself in a world that never stopped changing. The other life was that of an actor who continuously had to embody characters carrying the pain, anger, loss, and memories of others. The more he acted, the more he felt he was leaving pieces of himself in each role, as if he himself had become a chain of memories that did not belong to him. There were nights after the stage lights went out, when he could not immediately leave the character, because the emotions were still stuck somewhere between reality and fiction. But right in that struggle, Delroy Lindo still did not stop. He continued to move forward, continued to learn how to turn pain into strength, turn loneliness into acting depth, as if his only will was not to let any part of himself be forgotten. He chose to live with that pressure, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way for him to exist fully in both worlds he belonged to. And that persistence had brought Delroy Lindo to a career that few could deny. He became one of the most respected actors in American cinema, especially with his profound roles in Spike Lee's works like Malcolm X or Clockers, where he demonstrated a rare and authentic ability to portray inner emotions powerfully. In The Good Fight, he left his mark with the role of Adrian Bozeman, a character full of intellect and power, reflecting his own depth in real life. The peak of his career came with Spike Lee's Day 5 Bloods, where he received strong acclaim from international critics and was nominated and honored by many major film critics associations. Although he did not chase glamorous titles, Delroy Lindo was still seen as an actor's actor, a performer whom his colleagues always respected for his authenticity and emotional intensity in every role. His legacy did not lie in mainstream fame, but in the way he turned each character into a lived experience, making audiences feel the truth behind the screen. Before continuing the story, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the journey behind Delroy Lindo, where the stage lights no longer hide the deepest cracks of a lifetime. A small heart you leave today is the respect given to a man who has spent his entire life living on behalf of the pain of others. Delroy Lindo was not born into a world with clear boundaries, but in a constantly moving intersection between cultures, where everything was both familiar and strangely unfamiliar. He was born into a Jamaican immigrant family in London, where his parents' dreams carried hope for a better life. But reality collided with the invisible walls of post-war society. From his early years, Delroy never had a fixed anchor to call home in the true sense. London was where he was born, but it was not where he felt he belonged. Jamaica was the root, but it was a distant memory rather than a real experience. And then life continued to take him through Canada and finally to the United States. Each place he set foot in carried the same sense of strangeness, as if he was always standing outside his own life. In new classrooms, new neighborhoods, new voices, Delroy was never the center, but always the observer, the listener, the one trying to decode social rules that no one explained to him. That constant movement not only created geographical instability, but also formed in him a special kind of awareness, the feeling that people do not live in just one world, but in many overlapping layers of worlds, where each person sees reality in their own way. But along with that observation came a quiet loneliness, because the more he understood the world around him, the more he felt he did not fully belong to any of it. At school, he was often the quiet one, not because he lacked thoughts, but because he needed time to understand how others thought before deciding whether to join the conversation. His silence was not withdrawal, but a form of cautious existence in an ever-changing environment. And in that silence, something special began to form, the ability to observe people with rare depth. Delroy learned to look into eyes, the way people paused when speaking, the way they reacted when no one was paying attention. And gradually he began to understand that every person carried an untold story. But this early understanding made him different in a lonely way, because not everyone wanted to be seen that deeply. In many environments he lived in, there were moments when he clearly sensed discrimination, not always direct, but sometimes just pauses in speech, fleeting glances, or the feeling of being placed at the edge of a space that was not meant for him. Those experiences did not turn him into an angry person, but turned him into someone who understood more deeply the complexity of people and society. From those observations, a profound inner world gradually formed, where every emotion was processed more slowly, more carefully, and sometimes more painfully. Delroy Lindo grew up not with the feeling that he belonged to a specific place, but with the awareness that he was standing between many worlds at once, not fully part of any of them. And that very suspension, which seemed like a disadvantage, became the first foundation for the way he would later see the world. A way of looking that was not simple, not one-sided, but always contained many layers of meaning stacked on top of each other. Just like his own life, from the very beginning, had never been a straightforward, easy path. Delroy Lindo grew up not in the noise of prominence or colorful childhood stories, but in a form of prolonged silence, where every emotion seemed to be held back rather than spoken out. It was not a comfortable silence, but the silence of a child who had to learn on his own how to understand the world before the world understood him back. In small rooms, in unfamiliar classrooms, in streets where he always felt slightly out of step with the common rhythm of life, Delroy early realized that talking too much did not always help him belong there. Instead, he began to observe. He observed the way adults talked, the way they interrupted each other, the way they changed their tone when facing different people, and even the pauses that sometimes said more than any words. From very early on, he learned that people exist not only through what they say, but also through what they deliberately do not say. That observation gradually became a part of how he existed, a habit that required no effort but shaped his entire inner world. While other children might express emotions directly, Delroy tended to keep everything inside, as if each emotion needed to be analyzed before being allowed to exist. Sadness was not just sadness, but a chain of causes and reactions. Anger was not just an immediate response, but the result of many layers of accumulation. And joy, if there was any, always came with some caution, as if he had learned that every emotion could disappear at any moment. That inner way of living gradually separated him from his surroundings, without him having to do it on purpose. While the outside world moved fast, clear, and sometimes noisy, Delroy operated at a different pace, slower, deeper, and more thoughtful. He began to form a special ability, analyzing people like characters in a story unfolding right before his eyes. A person who spoke loudly was not simply confident, but might be someone trying to hide insecurity. A silent person was not always weak, but might be observing more than others. These perceptions did not come from books, but from his own life experiences moving between many different environments, where he always had to find his own way to understand without clear explanations. But along with that early understanding came a prolonged feeling of difference. Delroy did not feel he fully belonged to any group. Somewhere, he was always the one standing slightly outside, not because he was pushed out, but because he sensed he did not completely match the rhythm of the environment around him. That difference was not loud, did not draw attention, but it existed like a background layer of his entire childhood. And right in that quiet difference, a form of inner strength began to form, not the strength of expression, but the strength of holding back emotions, holding back observations, holding back thoughts that did not yet need to be spoken. Delroy Lindo grew up that way, not like a child clearly defined by his environment, but like someone gradually creating his own way to understand the world. And though he did not know it then, that prolonged silence, that non-stop ability to observe, would become the foundation for his entire later life, where he not only lived as one person, but also lived as someone who could understand and embody many different lives. Delroy Lindo entered the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, not like someone seeking fame, but like someone who had finally found a place that allowed the silence inside him to be turned into language. After many years of observing life from the outside, standing in environments that did not fully belong to him, he stepped for the first time into a space where emotions no longer had to be hidden, but could be expressed in a structured, purposeful, and meaningful way. Acting school was not an easy place. It demanded emotional rawness, honesty, to the point of sometimes being painful, and that very thing made Delroy feel it was the only place where he could exist fully. The first time standing on a professional theater stage, he was no longer the observer standing outside life, but became a part of it, where every glance, every line, every breath carried the weight of a story unfolding right before the audience's eyes. It was a moment very different from all his previous experiences, because, for the first time, the silence inside him was no longer a void, but became the foundation to build emotions. When he delivered a line, it was not just the character's words, but the crystallization of everything he had observed, held back, and not said throughout his childhood and youth years. Broadway, and the theater world in general, opened up a new dimension for him, where people were not limited by living circumstances, but defined by their ability to express their inner world. There, Delroy began to understand that acting was not pretending to be someone else, but finding the truest parts of himself to give to the character. And that realization completely changed the way he saw life. From a quiet observer, he gradually turned into someone who could recreate emotions, who could enter another person's psychology and live experiences that were not his own. The stage became the first place that made him feel he was no longer fragmented between different worlds, but could connect all those layers of observation, emotion, and memory into a single flow. But this change did not come easily or gently, because to stand firmly on stage, he had to confront his own inner limits. Opening up on stage sometimes meant touching emotional regions that he had learned to hold back in silence. There were roles that made him feel like he was digging deep into himself, where the boundary between Delroy Lindo and the character blurred in a dangerous way. But right in that ambiguity, he found strength. Broadway was not just a workplace, but a place that reshaped his entire artistic path, where he realized that his voice, though once suppressed by circumstances and difference, could finally exist clearly and with weight. And from that moment, Delroy Lindo was no longer just an observer of life, but became someone who recounted life with his own body, voice, and emotions, opening up a journey he never knew he would go so far on. Hollywood did not open up before Delroy Lindo like a wide door for dreams, but more like a long hallway where every step was evaluated before being allowed to go further. After leaving the theater stage and stepping into the film world, he quickly realized that what he had learned about expressive freedom on Broadway did not fully match the strict structure of Hollywood. There, his presence was not always placed in the center, but often limited to ready-made role templates, where black actors were often viewed through fixed images of strength, intensity, or functional supporting roles for other people's stories. Delroy did not come to Hollywood with naivety, but the reality was still heavier than any preparation he had ever had. He saw himself appearing in roles where the character could be strong, could be memorable, but rarely led the story in a comprehensive way. And that created a quiet paradox. He was seen, but not truly placed at the center. While his inner world always sought the complexity of human beings, Hollywood often wanted only a simplified, more consumable version. That gap made his journey not only an artistic one, but also a journey of preserving his identity in a system that continuously tried to reshape it. The early years in Hollywood were a series of days of prolonged patience, where each role became a test of his own value. There was no immediate explosion of fame, no full recognition, only small opportunities that required him to prove himself again and again in the same professional life. With each project, Delroy Lindo not only played the character, but also had to prove that his existence in this industry was justified. It was a form of pressure that was not loud but prolonged, where fatigue did not come from the intensity of work, but from continuously having to answer an implicit question. Was he valuable enough to be seen as a center or not? In that context, many actors might change themselves to better fit market expectations. But Delroy chose a different way. He did not try to shrink himself to fit the mold, but continued to dig deeper into the quality of acting, into the inner depth of each character, even when that did not guarantee him immediate prominence. That choice made him a special kind of artist in Hollywood. Not someone who easily became a mainstream star, but someone whom the industry professionals always respected for authenticity and depth. However, along with that respect came a prolonged sense of isolation, because the deeper he went into the profession, the more he realized that excellence did not always mean wide recognition. There were times when he stood on the boundary between being highly regarded and being overlooked, where each role became a step in the journey to prove that he was not just a supporting part in the system, but an artist with his own voice. But Hollywood, with its structure, did not always make space for such voices. Delroy Lindo therefore lived in a special state of existence. He was present in this industry, but did not fully belong to its center, and that very state created a form of prolonged tension, where he had to maintain artistic integrity while facing the reality that recognition sometimes came much slower than the real value he brought. Nevertheless, he did not leave, did not stop, did not give up. Instead, he continued to go deeper into the craft, as if each role was a way for him to affirm that his presence was not accidental, but the result of a long journey of perseverance and will. Hollywood might not have fully opened its door to him from the beginning, but Delroy Lindo chose to stay long enough to force that door to change the way it looked at him. Delroy Lindo gradually realized that what made him different in Hollywood was not the ability to blend in, but precisely the excessive level of authenticity in the way he approached each role. In an industry that often prioritized speed, image, and commercializability, his acting style went in a completely different direction. Slow, internal, and always digging deep into the most complex emotional layers of human beings. He did not act to make an immediate impression, but acted as if he were trying to understand a real person existing in real life. That very thing made him special, but at the same time also made it difficult for him to fit into Hollywood's fast production molds. There were roles that required simplification, but Delroy brought into them an entire layered inner world, making the character deeper, heavier, and sometimes going beyond what the original script desired. That authenticity was not always easily accepted, because it forced viewers to confront real emotions rather than simple entertainment. And in an industry that operated based on mainstream tastes, that sometimes became an invisible barrier. However, Delroy did not change his way of working to fit the market. He did not choose an easier path, nor did he try to turn himself into a more consumable image. Instead, he continued to pursue roles with depth, characters carrying complex internal conflicts, stories that demanded patience from both the actor and the audience. That persistence created a very unique artistic identity where he was not swept into the whirlwind of quick fame, but chose to build value over time. While many of his contemporaries might achieve widespread fame by adjusting their image to better fit the market, Delroy accepted a slower, less certain path, but one more honest to himself. That did not mean his path was easy. On the contrary, it was full of periods where recognition came slowly or did not come in a clear way. There were times when he stood between high regard from professionals and the absence of mainstream recognition, creating a hard-to-name gap in his career. But instead of seeing it as failure, he saw it as a natural part of the journey of preserving authenticity in art. Delroy understood that if he traded depth for faster fame, he would lose the core that made him who he was. And so, he continued to go deeper into each character, continued to question the person he was portraying, continued to search for the hidden emotional layers beneath the dialogue. In the harsh, competitive environment of Hollywood, where attention often came and went very quickly, maintaining such a style required not only talent but also rare steadfastness. Delroy did not chase the stage lights, but the stage lights gradually began to turn back to look at him in a different way, because even if he was not always the central face in the media, he was the one that directors and colleagues trusted when they needed an actor who could bring real depth to the story. And precisely in that contradiction between not fully belonging to the mainstream yet still being impossible to overlook, Delroy Lindo built a distinct position for himself in this industry, where his personal identity was not traded away, but kept firm through each role, each choice, and each year of perseverance in the profession. Delroy Lindo stepped into a new phase in his career when he began collaborating with Spike Lee, one of the few directors in Hollywood at that time who could see and exploit the real depth in the actors he worked with. For Delroy, this was not just a professional opportunity, but for the first time in his long journey, there was someone who truly placed faith in his ability to turn complex inner experiences into cinematic language. In Spike Lee's film world, characters did not exist as simple figures, but carried social context, history, and layers of suppressed emotions. And right in that space, Delroy Lindo found a rare resonance between himself and the role, where he no longer had to reduce his depth to fit, but, on the contrary, that depth became the most important part of the character. The roles he took on in Spike Lee's films were not just opportunities to showcase acting technique, but places where he began to touch on larger social issues: race, identity, violence, collective memory, and the complexity of human beings in a stratified society. In the process, audiences for the first time began to see Delroy not just as an excellent actor, but as someone capable of conveying systemic pains, emotions that belonged not only to the individual, but also to the entire community. The collaboration with Spike Lee helped him step out of the limits of functional supporting roles and move closer to characters with real psychological depth, where every decision of the character carried a long history behind it. This was the period when recognition for him began to change noticeably, no longer coming only from people in the industry, but gradually spreading to audiences and critics. People began to talk about Delroy Lindo as an actor with strong inner power, someone capable of bringing almost painful authenticity in every scene. However, even as recognition increased, he still had not completely escaped the invisible limits of the film industry. He was highly regarded, but not always placed at the center of major projects. He was respected, but not always given the opportunity to lead stories in the most comprehensive way. That created a prolonged paradox in his career. The more he was recognized as a profound talent, the more he existed on the boundary between recognition and limitation. But instead of seeing it as failure, Delroy Lindo continued to view it as a natural part of the artistic journey he had chosen. He understood that not every value was immediately reflected through fame or a central position in the industry, and sometimes the real weight of an actor lay in the ability to leave a mark in each role, whether large or small. Precisely in the phase of collaboration with Spike Lee, he began to build the image of an actor who did not need to appear everywhere, but each appearance carried a clear and unforgettable emotional depth. These roles not only helped him affirm himself in the eyes of professionals, but also helped him move closer to perfecting his own artistic identity, where acting was not just a profession, but a way to dialogue with deeper issues of human beings and society. Nevertheless, Delroy still continued to stand between two worlds: one world where he was recognized as an actor with depth, and one world where he still had to keep proving his position in a system that never fully opened up for everyone in the same way. And that very parallelism, once again, reflected more clearly the double life he had lived for many years. One life of gradually forming recognition, and one life of limitations that had not completely disappeared. Delroy Lindo stepped into the Malcolm X project like stepping into a cinematic space where every detail carried the weight of history, where every glance, Every silence, every smallest movement of the character was not just acting, but the recreation of an era full of upheaval. In Spike Lee's film, he did not stand at the center of the story, but was one of the important pieces that created the emotional depth of the entire work. His role was not built to attract attention through explosive moments, but existed like a quiet flow where pain and restraint were held inside more than revealed outward. That very thing made Delroy Lindo a special kind of actor in this project, someone who did not need to take up space with noise, but with the weighty presence of silence. In Malcolm X, every character carried a part of history, and Delroy approached his role with near absolute restraint, as if he understood that not every emotion needed to be spoken to become powerful. Instead, he let pauses, glances, and the smallest reactions become the place where real emotion existed. It was a form of acting that required high-level control, but also demanded the courage not to hide the deep layers inside the character's person. When the film was released, critics quickly realized that this was not just a cinematic work about history and politics, but also a complex psychological portrait of people at moments when they were pushed to their limits. And in that portrait, Delroy Lindo was one of those who contributed to creating the emotional depth. Even though he was not the face placed at the center of the media, positive evaluations from professionals began to come to him more clearly. When people realized that he was not just an actor with good technique, but someone capable of conveying layers of emotion without needing to exaggerate them. However, even with that success, Delroy Lindo had still not completely stepped into the central position of Hollywood. He was recognized, respected, but not always given roles that led the entire story. This created a quiet truth in his career. He was always very close to the center of important works, but rarely the ones standing right in the middle of their spotlight. Nevertheless, Malcolm X was still an important milestone, not only for its cinematic value, but because it was one of the rare times Delroy Lindo was placed in an artistic space where his silence was not seen as a shortcoming, but considered an essential part of storytelling. In that restraint, he expressed a form of pain that needed no words, a form of memory that needed no explanation, and a form of presence that needed no display. It was the kind of acting that could only come from someone who had lived long enough with observation, deep enough with the inner world, and patient enough to understand that sometimes the strongest thing was not what was spoken, but what was held back. And right from that moment, Delroy Lindo continued his journey in Hollywood, still on the boundary between recognition and limitation, still living in the two parallel worlds he had carried for so long, and still continuing to prove that his silence was never absence, but a form of existence deeper than any words. After Malcolm X, and then the increasingly clear marks in Spike Lee's works, Delroy Lindo stepped into a phase that many outsiders would call success. He was recognized more, his name appeared more frequently in discussions about powerful acting, and critics began to view him as one of the most reliable faces when a role with psychological depth was needed. But behind all of that, the feeling inside him did not change in the way people usually think when talking about success. There was no explosion of joy, no feeling of complete fulfillment, but only a continuation of the state that had existed for a very long time, the quiet isolation between a world that was seeing him more clearly and an inner world that still kept its silence intact. Hollywood, with all its glamour and fast pace, never truly became a place Delroy Lindo belonged to. He was not swept into the whirlpools of party life, did not seek presence in ostentatious entertainment spaces, and did not try to build a public image beyond his acting work. That choice did not come from deliberate rejection, but from a natural instinct formed very early, keeping distance from things that were unnecessary in order to preserve the deepest part of himself. But that very distance created another form of loneliness. A form of loneliness that did not come from being excluded, but from voluntarily standing at the edge of a world while still working inside it. His fame grew larger, but his personal life did not change in the way many might imagine. There was no merging between the two worlds, no moment when the stage light stepped into his private life and made it more complete. Instead, Delroy Lindo lived in the parallel existence of two realities. One reality where he was a respected, highly regarded, and acknowledged actor, and one reality where he was simply a quiet, taciturn person who observed more than participated and often kept the most important thoughts to himself. That parallelism did not cause loud conflict, but it created a prolonged emotional depth where every experience was processed slowly and internalized. As his career developed, Delroy did not become louder, but on the contrary became even quieter in the way he approached the world around him. He did not seek external validation in the way the industry usually encouraged, but continued to focus on digging deeper into each role, as if every character was a separate space where he could continue to explore different parts of human nature. But that very focus also meant he participated even less in the other parts of Hollywood life, where social presence was sometimes just as important as artistic presence. The gap between fame and personal life, therefore, did not disappear, but only became clearer over time. People saw him on screen with strength, inner power, and depth. But very few people truly knew about the life behind those roles, where there was no script, no director, and no audience. That separation created a special form of existence, a person seen very clearly in art, but keeping almost absolute privacy in life. And in that separation, Delroy Lindo's inner world did not stop, but continued to develop in a quieter, deeper, and somewhat more solitary direction. He did not change to become more accessible to the outside world, but instead continued to go deeper into himself, as if the most important journey was not conquering Hollywood, but understanding more clearly the nature of human beings through each role. Success, therefore, did not become the end point of loneliness, but only became a new layer in the long journey of the parallel existence he had lived for so long. In the phase when many people thought Delroy Lindo had reached stability in his career, the role of Adrian Boseman in The Good Fight appeared as a special milestone, not only because of its artistic weight, but also because of the strange intersection between the character and the man himself. Adrian Boseman was not the type of character who easily impressed with explosions or overly dramatic moments, but a man of intellect, sharp arguments, and at the same time of prolonged inner fatigue. That combination made the role a special space, where Delroy Lindo did not need to step out of himself to embody it, but almost only needed to go deeper into the parts he had carried for a very long time. In Adrian Boseman, people saw a form of energy very similar to Delroy in real life, a calmness built from experience, a gaze always containing many layers of thought, and an emotional restraint that gave every word its own weight. But behind that intellectual strength was a form of fatigue that was not displayed, like the price of always having to be the one who understood the issue before others even realized it existed. This role, therefore, was not just a character in a television series, but became an almost direct reflection of the inner journey Delroy Lindo had gone through over many decades. When he portrayed Adrian Boseman, there was no longer a clear boundary between the actor and the character, because both seemed to share a form of awareness about the world, understanding too much, feeling too deeply, and holding back too many things inside. That very sameness made every scene heavier, not because the script was complicated, but because of the emotional depth he brought into each moment. Audiences did not just see a sharp lawyer in the legal system, but also felt a person gradually being worn down by his own alertness. This was the phase when Delroy Lindo's acting technique reached a clearly mature level, where he no longer needed big gestures or strong expressions to convey emotion, but only needed a glance paused at the right time, a prolonged silence, or a slightly slower breath to create the entire atmosphere of the scene. That subtlety did not come from display, but from an inner life that had been forged through many years standing on the boundary between observation and experience. The Good Fight, therefore, was not just another professional success, but a testament to his artistic maturity, where Delroy Lindo no longer had to prove anything, but only needed to be present in the most authentic way possible. But even in this phase, considered the peak of acting technique, he still did not become part of Hollywood's noise. He did not change his way of living, did not expand his public presence, and did not step into spaces that usually came with big television fame. Instead, he continued to keep the familiar distance between the artistic world and his personal life, as if the most important thing was not becoming the center of attention, but maintaining honesty in the way he approached each role. And that very thing made Adrian Boseman not just a beloved character, but also an important part of Delroy Lindo's long journey, where he did not just play the role, but gradually turned the role into a mirror reflecting his own inner existence. In Day of Five Bloods, Delroy Lindo stepped into a cinematic space completely different from anything he had experienced before, where memory was no longer something belonging simply to the past, but became a living entity, heavy and always returning like a wound that had never been healed. Spike Lee's film placed him at the center of a story about war, about brotherhood, about the betrayal of time, and most importantly about the psychological wounds that stretched across many decades from which people could not easily escape. His role was not just a soldier returning from the battlefield, but a person carrying the full weight of personal history and collective history, where the past never truly ended, but only changed shape. When Delroy Lindo entered the role, he did not approach the character as an ordinary role, but as a journey digging deep into emotional layers that had accumulated for a very long time in a person, where pain was no longer an event, but became a prolonged state of existence. In every scene, he expressed a special form of energy, both explosive and restrained, both angry and wounded, as if the character was continuously being pulled between the present and the unforgettable war memories. What made this role special was not only the script or the historical context, but the way Delroy turned every moment into an inner dialogue between the present person and the person who had once gone through war. When he stood in front of the camera, people did not just see a character telling a story, but saw a person reliving everything that seemed to have been buried, and that very reliving carried a very great emotional weight, because it was not expressed as a distant memory, but as a wound still bleeding in the present. In the process of working with Spike Lee once again, Delroy Lindo found an artistic space where authenticity was not only encouraged, but pushed to the extreme. And this time he did not just play a character, but played an entire forgotten history, a part of the memory of black soldiers in the Vietnam War, people who carried experiences that society did not always see fully. That very thing made his role not only personal, but also symbolic. One of the important factors contributing to the film's weight was the presence of Chadwick Boseman, who brought a completely different energy to the story, like a gentle but profound counterpoint in the overall heavy emotional tone of the work. The interaction between the characters was not just acting, but like pieces of memory touching each other in a space where time no longer operated in the normal way. For Delroy Lindo, working on this project was not just a professional experience, but also a process of confronting the deep layers of collective and personal pain, where war was not just the background, but a prolonged part in the human mind. What made his role in DI 5 Blood special was the way he expressed pain not through simple explosion, but through prolonged accumulation, where every word, every glance, every silence contained many overlapping layers of emotion. This was no longer acting in the ordinary sense, but a form of inner release, where a person was forced to confront what had been buried for too long. When the film was released, critics quickly realized that this was one of the most powerful performances in Delroy Lindo's career, not only because of the acting technique, but because of the emotional depth he brought to the character. People saw in him not just an actor performing an excellent role, but a person who had gone through many layers of memory and found a way to turn those memories into art. This role therefore became an important convergence point in his career journey, where everything he had accumulated over many decades, the observation, the silence, the patience, and even the moments of loneliness, were crystallized into a performance considered the peak. But even when recognized so widely, Delroy Lindo still did not change his human nature in this industry. He did not step into the center of Hollywood glamour, did not seek ostentation, and did not let success change the way he approached art. Instead, he continued to keep a certain distance, as if the most important thing was not his position in the industry, but the honesty he could maintain in each role. Date of Five Bloods, therefore, was not just an important film in his career, but also a milestone where past, memory, and art intersected, creating one of the most highly regarded performances in Delroy Lindo's entire acting journey. A man who had turned pain into language and turned memory into lasting artistic strength. After Day 5 Bloods, when the lights of the film festivals gradually dimmed and the praises from critics became memories stored in his professional record, Delroy Lindo stepped into a phase that from the outside might be called stable, but inside was a state of existence that became increasingly clear as the splitting of identity. It was not a sudden or dramatic separation, but a process that stretched across many decades, quietly formed from the first years he stepped into acting, and now became clearer than ever. One life of his took place in front of the camera, where Delroy Lindo was strong, complex characters, sometimes explosive, sometimes restrained, always carrying emotional depth that made audiences pause and think. But parallel to it was another life, with no script, no director, no stage lights, where he was simply a quiet person who observed more than spoke, lived slower than the world around him, and kept most of his emotions to himself. Those two lives did not oppose each other in the sense of conflict, but existed like two parallel flows, sometimes close, sometimes far, but never truly merging into one completely. For Delroy, this was not a secret to hide, but a natural state of existence in the profession he had chosen. Acting, for him, had never been only about stepping into a character, but about opening up another part of himself to live in it for a certain period of time. But when the camera stopped, that part did not disappear immediately, but still lingered like an emotional aftertaste, creating a layer overlapping real life. That was why the public image of him always reflected only a very specific part. The powerful actor with inner strength, with the ability to control emotions and portray complex roles naturally, but his private person was not completely like that. There was no performance, no need to show off, but a prolonged silence, where he observed the world more than participating in it loudly. This difference did not create a shock or clear contradiction, but existed like an invisible line that could only be felt over time. Throughout more than 50 years in the profession, Delroy Lindo lived in that state of split identity, without trying to unify it. He did not see the public part as fake, nor the private part as completely separate. But both were necessary parts for him to exist fully in this profession. One side was where he expressed, the other side was where he accumulated. One side was where emotions were released, the other side was where emotions were held back and observed. That very parallelism created a special form of balance, even if not always comfortable, but sustainable over time. When looking back, people might think this was a double life in a mysterious or dramatic sense, but for Delroy, it was much simpler. It was the way he lived so he could continue doing the job without losing the deepest part of himself. Two streams of emotion always existed in him, one flowing outward through the characters and one flowing inward, where he continued to observe, continued to understand, continued to accumulate experiences that were never spoken on screen. And that very parallel existence, stretching across many decades, had shaped his entire artist self, not as an individual who was divided, but as a person living in multiple layers of reality at the same time, where each layer had its own meaning and did not need to eliminate the other to exist. While Delroy Lindo's career went through many layers of ups and downs in the spotlight of Hollywood, his private life moved at a completely different rhythm, separate, quiet, and almost never seeking attention. There were no crowded auditoriums full of audiences, no long rounds of applause, and no widely circulated interviews. There was only a stable life built on long-term attachment to family, where he found a form of balance that the glamour of the profession could not bring. His marriage to Delroy Lindo was not a story told many times in public because both chose to keep this relationship away from the media, as if privacy was the most important thing to protect what truly mattered. In an industry where relationships were often scrutinized, analyzed, and sometimes turned into entertainment stories, their silence became a deliberate choice, a way to keep love from being defined by the outside. Delroy did not appear as a supporting character in Delroy's career story, but as a quiet foundational part, where stability was formed not from attention, but from persistent presence over time. Together, they built a living space separate from the whirlwind of fame, where basic values like respect, trust, and privacy were placed first. Their son, Delroy Lindo, grew up in an environment not dominated by stage lights, where his father's fame did not become the center of childhood, but only a very distant part of outside life. This choice was not a withdrawal from the world, but a way to ensure that family life was not dissolved in the pressure of the entertainment industry. While Delroy Lindo appeared on screen with complex, strong characters full of inner depth, behind the scenes he kept a completely different role: a father, a husband, a person who always tried to maintain stability in a world that was inherently unstable. That very stability became the most important spiritual foundation in his life, helping him continue to face emotionally heavy roles without being completely swept into them. Family was not a place opposing his career, but a place that helped him keep the balance between the two worlds he always lived in at the same time. When stepping out of the film set, he did not bring the glamour of the profession into his personal life, but left it behind the door where it belonged. This created a clear but not rigid boundary between public and private, between the actor and the man in the family. Throughout many years, this privacy was not broken by outside factors because both he and his family actively kept distance from the media, not turning personal life into part of the public image. That very choice made their life not shaped by fame, but built on more stable and long-lasting values. And in the context of a career always tied to characters with complex inner lives, the simplicity and stability of family became the most important anchor, where Delroy Lindo could return to himself without needing to play any role. It was a form of love that did not need to be brought into the light, did not need to be recognized by the public, but still existed sustainably over time, like a quiet but essential part in his entire journey of living and working. Throughout his long journey in Hollywood, Delroy Lindo was rarely the name placed at the center of mainstream conversations, but he always appeared in deeper discussions about the art of acting, where people did not talk about instant fame, but about endurance, depth, and authenticity in each role. His career, seen from the outside, might not take the form of a mainstream star in the traditional sense, not tied to media explosions or continuous global coverage moments, but was built solidly on the respect of professionals and those who understood the real value of acting. What was special in Delroy Lindo's journey was that he never had any major scandal attached to his name, no shocking media incidents, and no public collapses often seen in the entertainment industry. However, that very stability came with a quiet paradox. In many phases of his career, he was not recognized at a level commensurate with the depth and quality he brought. There were times when his roles were highly praised by critics, but did not create corresponding mainstream impact, making him always exist in a space in between, respected but not always widely celebrated. Nevertheless, Delroy Lindo never changed the path he had chosen just to fit the quick attention of the market. He continued to pursue difficult roles, characters with complex inner depth, stories that demanded patience from both the performer and the viewer. That persistence shaped him as a special kind of artist in Hollywood, someone who did not seek short-term spotlight but built value over the long term. In an industry that often prioritized speed, image, and accessibility, Delroy went in the opposite direction, digging deeper, slower, and more honest with each character he took on. This made him a form of actor's actor, a term used in the film industry to refer to actors respected by their peers more than pushed by the media into mainstream icons. His roles, especially in socially and psychologically oriented works, often left a mark not through ostentation but through gradual emotional accumulation, where every glance, every silence carried its own weight. That very approach created a quiet but profound influence on many later generations of actors who saw in him a different path in acting, not based on instant fame, but on perseverance and authenticity. Delroy Lindo did not just play characters, but unintentionally became a model for a serious approach to art, where acting was not a tool to build personal image, but a means to explore human beings at their deepest layers. And that very consistency made him gradually become one of the symbols of inner acting in Hollywood. Even if that was not always mentioned loudly in the media, there was a quiet truth in his career. The further he went in the profession, the less he needed instant recognition to define his value. Instead, he relied on the quality of each role, on the honesty in each choice, and on the ability to maintain artistic identity amid a system that always changed quickly. That very thing created a career not based on explosive peaks, but on a long, stable path where each step had its own weight. Even if he was not always at the center of mainstream attention, Delroy Lindo still held a special position in the film industry, where he was seen as a standard of seriousness in acting. And in the context of Hollywood constantly changing, the values he represented, patience, depth, and authenticity, became even rarer, making his artistic legacy not lie in the noise of fame, but in the sustainability of the influence he left for those who truly cared about the art of acting. After more than 50 years in his career, Delroy Lindo did not walk the path that people usually use to define success in Hollywood, nor did he let his life be told through explosive moments or the dramatic turns often seen in film stories. Instead, his journey was like a long, steady but profound flow where every experience accumulated into a complex inner structure, both clear and hard to grasp. When looking back at his entire career, people did not see a single-line story of progression from hardship to glory, but the parallel existence of many layers of reality, where one man was both a respected actor on screen and a quiet individual living in an unostentatious private life. Those two lives never truly separated or confronted each other, but existed together like two parallel flows, sometimes so close they could not be distinguished, sometimes so far they seemed to belong to two different worlds. And that very parallelism shaped Delroy Lindo's entire presence in the film industry. He was not someone who pursued fame at all costs, nor someone who turned himself into the center of the media, but someone who persistently built value through the depth of each role, each choice, each silence on screen. What was special in his journey was that there was no explosive tragedy that broke things apart, no public collapse or shocking turning point, but instead a prolonged, quiet existence, where everything happened at a slow but certain pace, as if his life was built not from peak moments, but from the continuous accumulation of experience and emotion. That was why, when talking about Delroy Lindo, people spoke not only about an actor, but also about a rare form of human depth in an industry often dominated by speed and short-term attention. Each of his roles, whether large or small, carried its own mark, not because of ostentation, but because of his ability to bring into it the entire understanding of human beings that he had accumulated through many years of observation and living. In the characters he portrayed, there was always a layer of unspoken emotion, a layer of thought lying beneath the dialogue, and a silence that carried more weight than any words. That was what made him a special actor, not in the sense of mainstream fame, but in the sense of respect from those who truly understood the art of acting. When looking back at those 50 years, What was clearest was not the awards or individual recognitions, but the consistency in the way he held himself in the profession, not trading depth for ease, not changing his identity to fit instant tastes, and not abandoning the difficult path just because it did not always bring clear light. Parallel to that career was a completely separate personal life, away from the noise of Hollywood, where he did not seek external validation, but built stability from very ordinary and enduring things. That very separation was not a painful division, but a natural choice that helped him maintain balance in a profession that always demanded very great emotional expenditure. And when those two lives continued to exist in parallel throughout decades, they did not fragment him, but on the contrary, created a person with more layers of meaning, where each layer reflected a different part of the same being. When the stage lights gradually dimmed, when the roles had been stored in cinematic memory, what remained was not the image of a star in the ordinary sense, but the image of a man who had lived fully in the complexity of himself without needing to explain it to the world. Delroy Lindo was not someone who was always seen fully in every aspect, and perhaps that was the deepest essence in his story, a life not defined by complete exposure, but by the persistent existence of layers of meaning that never ran out. Looking back at Delroy Lindo's entire journey, what remained was not the usual glamour of a Hollywood star, but the quiet feeling of a man who had lived too long in the state of never being seen fully. From the early days, stepping out to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, where he first found his voice on stage, to the years limited to supporting roles in Hollywood, then gradually recognized through Spike Lee and works like Malcolm X or Die Five Bloods, his journey always carried a subtle sadness, being seen but never completely understood. The details about him having to live two parallel lives, one on-screen full of inner power, and one quiet private life separate from the lights, were not a loud tragedy, but a form of prolonged loneliness, quietly eroding over time. Even when praised by critics as an actor's actor, one of the deepest actors of his generation, he still did not truly become the center of Hollywood, as if the world always looked at him through a foggy layer of prejudice and stereotypes. What made his story poignant was not failure, but the relentless persistence in proving his value in a system that did not easily grant central positions to different voices. But right in that quietness, Delroy Lindo became a symbol of endurance, a person who chose to dig deep into human beings instead of chasing glamour. The lesson for American audiences was not only about art or success, but about the value of steadfastness in a world that always demanded instant prominence. Not everyone who is not fully seen lacks value, and sometimes the most important people are those who continue to create meaning even when they do not stand in the center of the light. If you feel the depth and quietness in Delroy Lindo's journey, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore the stories behind the stage lights, where the real person appears most clearly. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to listen to lives full of layers of meaning that have never been fully told.